Welcome to the Conoy Church podcast. We're glad that you're interested in connecting through this teaching time. If you'd like to connect further, feel free to reach out to us through our website, conoychurch.org. For now, enjoy this teaching from Conoy Church, where our mission is to lead people into a growing relationship with Jesus Christ.
For the month of November, we're doing kind of a short series called Enemies of the Heart. And today, we get to talk about something super fun, greed. We're looking at this series. It's actually a book. Looks like this. You can get this anywhere you want. I didn't write it, so I don't get money if you get it. But it's a good book called Enemies of the Heart by a guy named Andy Stanley. And in the series, we look at a couple of different emotions, guilt, anger, greed, and jealousy. And we're looking at what happens when we give those things full access to our heart. We're not looking at these things because we think that our church has a particular problem with any one of these things, but we are realizing that if we're honest, that probably all of us could say, I do struggle a little bit with one of the things on that list. And if we're honest, we probably all know somebody that we care about, whether it's a coworker, a loved one, a family member, a friend, somebody who does struggle with something on this list. So hopefully this series helps prepare you for how we can interact with someone or ourselves if we struggle with some of these things. The other thing that we realize is that Thanksgiving is coming up. I mean, Thanksgiving is this week, which seems crazy to me. And while I hope that everybody's Thanksgiving is fantastic, I also remember that it was only a few short years ago that some of our families had trouble meeting because of the outcomes of an election, because of a virus, because of stances on masking. It wasn't long ago that we felt pretty divided over some stuff. And while we often like to say blood's thicker than water, some of us came to a really hard realization that blood's not thicker than politics and religion and sickness and viruses and all of that. Knowing that we're not that far from a time when we were pretty divided, as we look at these jealousy, anger, guilt, greed, as we look at these things, I think it's a mature person who does work on their own heart in preparation for what they may encounter in the world. It makes sense to do preparation and work on your own heart in case of the possibility that you are interacting with somebody this holiday season who isn't going to give you their very best, right? Because when people don't give us their very best, when they don't extend to us the sort of grace and care and concern that we really think we should get, sometimes we react out of like a knee-jerk reaction. And what we want to do is talk about some of the things that we feel so that we don't react out of a knee-jerk reaction, but instead we can be the hands and feet of Jesus, no matter somebody's words, actions, or demeanor in a situation. So that's why we're talking about these things. So today, and lastly, it'll be next week, will be the last one, we're going to talk about three things. The first thing is, what is the thing? So today, what is greed? Then we're going to talk about how to confront it, how do you confront greed? And then we'll talk about the power of something that is an alternative to greed. And today, I'll give it to you. It's generosity. What's the alternative to greed? Generosity. So we're going to talk about those things. And then I'll just say this, and then we'll jump in. The easiest thing to do in situations when we talk about things we're uncomfortable with is to remember times when we were the victim. Remember times that other people were greedy rather than really thinking hard about times that maybe we struggled with it. And so I want to encourage you to not just do the easy thing, but really look inwardly and consider whether or not it's something that you have or do struggle with. All right, we're gonna jump in. First thing I do want to say though is I do think that greed is sort of a paradigm. All right, it's a scale. So on this end, maybe you have folks that struggle with greed, and on this end you have generosity. And everywhere, we're all somewhere on this spectrum. Some of us we lean more toward generosity. Some of us lean more toward greed. I don't think there's any person that is just like all the way at this end of the spectrum and is themselves the embodiment of the green-eyed jealousy monster. I don't think that. I think that we're all somewhere on this spectrum. I think generosity is what God calls us to. And my hope is that maybe today you will decide that you're going to take one step closer to this end. That's it. So I'm not going to sit here and call any of you greedy. I'm not going to sit here and like beg for money. That's not what this sermon is. What I am going to do, though, is I'm going to talk about greed. Because if you are familiar with Scripture, one of the things that you will know is that Jesus talks more about money than almost anything else in his time on earth. And maybe you don't know that. But Jesus takes that so seriously that he spends so much of his words on our interaction with money. So it is something that we do need to talk about from time to time in church. And if we don't talk about it here, it's going to continue to be one of those taboo subjects that we aren't willing to talk about anywhere. We're always going to be uncomfortable with it. When we're defining guilt, we said guilt said, I owe you. When we defined anger, we said anger says, you owe me. And greed says, I owe me. A person who struggles with greed believes that they deserve every good thing that comes their way. And a lot of them will even say something more like, what's mine is mine because I earned it. Have you ever heard anybody say that? I know I have. I mean, living in Lancaster County, I'm not saying that we're like greedy people, but we have this like Lancaster County Protestant work ethic thing where we work really hard and then we work hard for what we earn something, so we deserve the thing, right? We worked hard for it, it's ours. And I know that because that is something that is so deep down in a struggle for me. Like that is something that I believed for a very long time. My wife is very different than that, and I'm lucky that I got to meet my wife because she's really pushed me to think differently about money, but I definitely was a person who felt like I earned that dollar, that's my dollar, I'm gonna do what I want with that dollar. There was no concept in my brain of saying that's God's dollar, right? So this is something that I personally continue to work through. So as I talk about this, as I share these things with you guys, just know I'm very much sharing those things with myself as well. Greed is a little different than the other enemies of the heart we've talked about. If you struggle with anger, then maybe you have an outburst, right? You kind of lose your cool, you lose your temper somewhere. If you struggle with guilt, you might be kind of secretive and you don't really want to talk about parts of your life. With greed, it's a little bit different because greed sort of hides itself in good qualities, okay? And I'll put it this way. These three words up on the screen, saving, planning, and security. I've never heard anybody say, I'm greedy. Like nobody, I don't think you've ever heard anybody raise their hand and go, I'm a greedy person and proud of it, right? We don't do that. But we are proud of other things. We're proud that we're good savers, right? We're proud that we're good financial planners. We're proud that we have done a lot of hard work to care for the security of our finances for the future. And all of these things are good. Don't hear me say they're bad. I'm not saying you shouldn't save or plan or have some security. I'm saying that greed often hides in those things. So rather than saying, I struggle with greed, we say things like, well, I'm not giving right now because I'm saving. And it's really important that I save. God calls us to be savers too, you know. I'm not giving right now, or I don't feel like I should give to this thing because I'm planning for my future, and this is not in that plan. But someday when I have this much money, I'll give then, right? I'm sure that you've heard that before. I'm sure that you've had conversations. Maybe you've even thought that someday when I have this much, then I will give. See, greed hides itself in good traits. And that's what we have to be cautious about. So again, I want to be clear. Don't hear me say that any of these things are bad. Hear me say that sometimes our heart's a little twisted when we say, these are things that I am, a saver, a planner, somebody who's worried about my security. Now, while greed hides itself from us, greed often can't hide itself from the people around us, okay? We find it easier to recognize greed in others than in ourselves. We recognize that people who struggle with greed probably talk a lot and worry a lot about money. People who struggle with greed are not cheerful givers. People who struggle with greed are reluctant to share. People who struggle with greed usually quibble over insignificant sums of money. People struggle with greed, they talk as though they have just enough to get by. People who struggle with greed often create a culture of secrecy, especially around finances around them. People who struggle with greed never let you forget what they've done for you. People who struggle with greed are reluctant to express gratitude. People who struggle with greed aren't content with what they have. People who struggle with greed attempt to control people with their money. Now, I'm not believing that you know somebody that fits every single part of that list, but I have to believe that at least one of those things made you think of a time that you struggled, or somebody that you know who has either maybe tried to control you with money, or somebody who that you know is just never content with what they have. The thing to know is that there are greedy rich people and there are greedy poor people. Greed is not a financial issue. Hear that. And how do I know that? Because when a greedy person gets richer, they aren't suddenly more content. When a greedy person gets richer, they don't give more cheerfully. They aren't less reluctant to share. When a greedy person gets richer, they don't suddenly stop reminding you of the things that they have done for you, okay? It's a heart issue. It's not a financial issue. You can have no money and be very greedy. You can have a lot of money and be very greedy. This isn't a financial issue. This isn't about the total sum in your bank account. This is about what's in your heart. And we all have stories about why we interact with money the way we interact with money. And I want to say I realize that. We all have reasons why we hold tight to our money or our stuff. Some of us were raised in a household that had little or to nothing, right, growing up. And so, like, I have a friend who, he always had hand-me-down clothes through school. And I remember him telling me after high school, he was like, someday when I have a kid, my kid is going to have name brand clothing. He's never going to go through what I went through by getting teased and bullied and whatnot, right? So for him, he's going to focus on making sure that his children have a certain type of clothing, and the reason is he doesn't want their experience to be his experience, right? We all have reasons why we do certain things, right? Some of you, I know, maybe shared a bedroom with a sibling growing up because things were pretty tight in the house, or maybe even you shared a bed with a sibling because there was only that many mattresses to go around, right? Some of you guys have lived in a time or a place when you saw a booming industry leave a town or a city, like steel, and you know what it's like to suddenly be left with nothing because the industry left the area. Some of you guys were raised in a family that didn't know how to budget money, and so money was spent as fast as it came in, and it was spent on things that just never lasted. And so you said, you know what, I'm not going to live that way. I'm going to save. I'm going to budget. I'm going to be frugal, right? I'm going to look for the best deal. I'm cutting out every coupon. We all have reasons why we interact with money the way we do. And we're not really digging into how do you do a budget? Why is a budget a good idea? That's not what this is about this morning. This is about your heart. And I want to share a story from the book here. This is a story about the author. He writes it himself about himself. And I think it'll help to illustrate what we're talking about in terms of your heart this morning. He points out that our relationship to our money and our stuff often tell us the measure of our heart. This incident took place at our summer camp, and as it happened, I was the worship leader for the week, which required me to bring my guitar to camp with me. But I didn't want a bunch of teenagers touching my precious guitar, so I brought two guitars. One I kept on stage, and the other one, the nice one, the one that was an extension of me, I kept locked in a case off to the side. Anytime a student asked me if he or she could play my guitar, I would say, sure, and then I would point to the cheap guitar I left on stage. Pretty good system. Actually, I saw it as good stewardship. I was protecting an asset God had given me to manage. About halfway through the week, however, a kid walked up and asked if he could play my good guitar. The jig was up. They were on to me. I remember standing there trying to come up with a plausible reason why that wasn't such a good idea. I considered lying and telling him that I left the key to the case in my cabin. Greed will make you do that kind of stuff, you know. But because I was there to teach the kids not to lie, I swallowed hard. I forced a smile, and I said, sure. I carefully lifted my precious guitar out of its case and handed it gingerly to this lanky 8th grader. He sat down and began playing while I stood right there beside him. After a few minutes, I realized how stupid I must look, so I wandered off to another part of the room, pretending to be busy, but all the time keeping my eyes on little Eddie Van Halen and my good guitar. Well, as fate or God or bad luck would have it, somebody ran into the room yelling for the kid to hurry out to do something. He jumped up, leaned my guitar against the railing, and hustled toward the door. As he bounded down the steps from the stage, I watched in horror, helpless, as my good guitar slowly toppled sideways and crashed to the stage floor. When I reached it, there was a dent in the wood and a scratch about an inch long. I was devastated. My perfect guitar wasn't perfect anymore. I was so mad I wanted to strangle the kid. And then it hit me. I was far, far more concerned with the condition of my guitar than I was the soul of that young man. My heart was exposed. I was so ashamed of myself. I wasn't just being careful. I had a greed problem. I had placed greater value on a possession than on a person, and that is the nature of greed. That's the line that I want you to hear echo this morning. I had placed higher value on a possession than on a person. That is the nature of greed. Interestingly enough, that little kid that played his guitar actually grows up to become a worship leader, like a nationwide. He founded the worship circle or something like that. But he's a big-time worship leader now, so they get to joke about the story back and forth. But that was a moment for Andy Stanley to realize his connection to his possessions, how much he put on his possessions. The last thing I'll say in defining fear before we move on to the next part is that greed is motivated by fear. Greed has this endless list of what ifs. What if the guitar gets dropped? What if the guitar gets scratched? What if it gets lost? What if there isn't enough? What if I don't get my fair share? What if the economy collapses? What if they have more? What if, right? There's an endless line of what ifs that leads us to fear and that leads us to greed. A person who struggles with greed believes that there is never, ever enough. They believe that if they eventually get enough to provide them with the security or whatever the thing is they want, they'll be good. But there's always one more what if around the corner, and so they never actually have enough. How do we confront greed? That's the next question we want to ask this morning. And to do that, I want to encourage you to open up your Bibles or your phone app, whatever it is you use, to Luke chapter 12. I want to read a short passage with you this morning. This is a story, kind of like last week, a time when Jesus was very casually interacting with a crowd of people, and then because of his interaction, Jesus decides to tell a parable. And a parable is a story that is used to tell a larger truth, okay? Often the details of the story aren't the most important thing. There's a major truth that's coming through when the story is told. And here, Jesus tells a parable. So I'm in Luke chapter 12, verse 13, and he's standing in a crowd, and someone in the crowd comes up to him and says, "Teacher, Rabbi, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And Jesus looks at the man and he says, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" I love that. And he says, Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you? Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." Now, we could probably stop right there. I could end the sermon, and you could just walk away. And if I just said, go and memorize that this week, that would be good enough. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. That is a hard truth for us to hear. It's a hard truth for us to learn. It's a hard truth for us to remember, especially living in the world and in even the country that we live in, right? Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Then Jesus, verse 16, tells them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "Well, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I'll store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. And that's where we'll end. I have 3 lessons that I want to communicate to you, briefly, easily. 3 lessons from this parable. The farmer, the rich landowner, the person who's the main character of the story, one of the things that he does is he never considers that God really has anything to do with what he has gotten himself. And this, I think, is a deep-rooted connection to our Lancaster County work ethic here. It's a deep-rooted indictment to me about, I earned it, it's mine. This farmer, this landowner, harvests all of this crop, and he goes, I have got so much. What am I going to do with it all? I know. I'm going to build bigger barns. My barns aren't big enough to house all this. I'll tear those down. I'll build some bigger ones. Because he thinks it's his. He never considers the role that God plays in this. So the farmer plants it, right? He works the ground. That's hard work, right? He goes through, he harvests it. Maybe he irrigates water to it so that it's getting watered the whole time. He's got hard work to do. Don't get me wrong. But who provides the sun and makes sure it's not too hot that it's a drought? Who provides the rain and makes sure that it's not too much that it's a flood or too little that it's a drought? Who makes sure that the nutrients are in the soil that are good? Who makes sure that the farmer is in good enough health to harvest the crop? There's all of these factors that are outside of what the farmer himself can control. And so while he looks at the crop that he's harvesting and says, wow, look at all this. I've done such a good job. It's so much hard work of mine. This is all mine. What should I do with it? In reality, if we're being not even that generous to God, at the very least, God has a huge stake in this wonderful, abundant crop that he has. But the farmer fails to see that he has such a huge part of it. So what's the lesson? The first lesson is this: no one earns anything by themselves. And look, I know that there's a part of us that sort of believes that we do. And right now in your head, you might even be searching for an example of a time that you can be like, okay, no, I can think of a time I earned something by myself. I can think of a time that I did it myself. Look, none of us are islands. None of us. You've been taught things, you've been shown things, you've been given things, you've been blessed with things. No one does anything by themselves. Certainly this farmer who has this abundant crop, it's not all his hard work. It's also God's. So that's lesson 1. Here's the other thing. The other thing the landowner does is he overlooks the God factor. That's what I'm going to call it. He assumes that his abundance of stuff is going to give him an abundance of time. Right? I've got all of this crop. I'm going to build bigger barns. I'll store it. And then for the next few years, I don't have to do anything. I'll just say, eat, drink, and be merry. Life is good. And yet that very night, his life is taken from him, right? What's the lesson? You run out of time before you run out of stuff. More precious than stuff, more precious than gold, more precious than money is the time that we are given. The time that we often let slip by us. The time that we often don't account for because we're busy doing, going, being gone. Time is more precious than stuff. Now, speaking of stuff, here's the last lesson. Who is going to get the rich landowner's stuff? Because in the parable, those are the words that God says to the man. Verse 20, if you look at it, he says, then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? So who gets this stuff now that he's out of time? Maybe children who haven't earned it, who haven't worked hard for it. Right? We could talk about that, but let's not. Maybe some servants. Maybe they're the inheritors of everything. Maybe the government comes in and takes it all and auctions it off or takes a portion for themselves or something. Who knows? I don't know who gets his stuff now that he's gone and he has this huge abundance of crop that can't fit in any barn. But somebody else will end up with it. So the final lesson is this. It's not a matter of if somebody else will get it. It's just a matter of how and when. Either we give it away when we have time, or it's taken away when our time runs out. And that feels, a bit like a gut punch, but there's truth to it. You can't take it with you. My Aunt Faye used to say that all the time when I was growing up. It never really made sense to me. I was like, yeah, all right, sure, you can't take it with you, whatever, but you can enjoy it while you're here, right? And but you don't know when here is done. We don't have that information. So if all I do is live for the here and now and for the stuff and the money and the whatever enjoyments it can give me right now, great, but I have no idea when now is done. So am I really going to get to enjoy it? What if I could somehow find a way to enjoy giving it to someone else? What if I could somehow find a way to enjoy blessing others with the stuff? Because it's not a matter of if somebody else will get it, it's a matter of when, right? Either I give it away while I have time, or when my time is done, it's given away for me. There's a quote in the book that the author says, and I want to finish our this section on that. He says this. He said, think of a time of a mugger that comes up to you, and he holds a gun, and he says, all right, your money or your life. Your money or your life. In that situation, we hand over the wallet, take the watch off, the rings off, whatever, right? We just give the stuff, right? The gun's pointed at us, your money or your life. We know how to answer the question, your money or your life, when the mugger asks us. But when God says it, we struggle to answer the question, right? That hit me hard. Why is it so easy when the burglar or the mugger comes and takes it for us to go, yep, it's not worth it. It's not worth my life. Here you go. But when God says, money or your life, we're like, well, maybe there's a way I can hold on to this. I'll just do this over here, and you can have all this, and you don't have to worry about this. This is my thing. Why do we do that when it's God asking the question? I don't know. I don't have the answer, but this struck me. Now, I want to finish this morning. I want to talk about generosity for a minute. And I want to clarify something, too. Having money isn't a bad thing, right? Some people have it, some people don't. Having it is not a bad thing. That's not the problem. It's having money and not knowing why, not knowing what to do with it. It's not having a mission or a vision for the money that you have for it. It's a lack of understanding, really, that ultimately God brings the rain, that ultimately you have plenty and excess because God gave you plenty and God gave you excess. And so when we don't understand that, that's when money becomes a trap. If we can keep that at the front of our mind, this is not really mine. This is something that has been given to me. I've been blessed with this excess. That changes everything about how we interact with money. And I think this is the thing that Jesus is trying to combat. Every time he talks about money, and every time he talks about greed, and every time he shares a parable, what he's trying to show you is it's not all about the money. It's all about the God who blesses you with it. And if it's all about the God who blesses you with it, that should change everything with how you interact with it. If it's somebody else's money, we're not really owners, right? If you think about the landowner in the parable, right? If God has blessed him with it, he's not really the owner, he's actually a manager of it, right? And in church, we would say that's stewardship. That's the church word we say. We say, be a good steward of what's been given to you. If we're managers, we shouldn't really feel guilty about what we've been given, whether that's a little or a lot. What we should feel is the responsibility to manage it well. Okay? So I don't want anybody walking out the door today thinking, well, I've got money in my bank account or my retirement and I should feel guilty. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you should make God Lord over that rather than you. How might things look different then? Like when a financial investor meets with you to talk about your money, like he talks about you about investing, retirement, the very first thing that they generally ask you is, well, what are your goals? What are your goals with your money? And why do they ask that? Because they want to manage it well according to your goals. Because it's not their money, it's your money. They're investing it for you, right? If we are the money managers and it's God's money, if we are managing it, we're the investors, then the very first thing that we should be doing is saying, God, what are your goals with this money? Why have you given this to me? Why have you blessed me with this? What are your goals for this? And if we are truly trying to honor God in that, if we are truly trying to say, yes, I'm going to be a good steward of the excess that God has given me, then what we need to do is set up our spending and our saving goals to be reflective of the goals that God has for our money. So what's the alternative to greed? It's this. It's simple. Ask God, what do you want me to do with my extra? God, what do you want me to do with my extra? Now, just for a second, plug it into the parable that Jesus tells. So we have a rich landowner. He gets this abundant harvest. And in the story that Jesus tells, the first thing he goes is, man, I got so much. What should I do? Let's build bigger barns, put it all away, and let's retire, kick back, move to Florida, play putt-putt for a while, and live, drink, and be merry, right? That's what he says. But what if his first reaction isn't, let's build bigger barns? What if his first reaction is, whoa, I've got so much. God, what do you want me to do with my extra? Well, the first thing that God says to him is, you're a fool. You've now tried to save all this? This very night, your life's taken from you. That's the first thing that God says to him in the story, because the first thing that the man does is want to build bigger barns to keep it all. But if he says, God, what should I do with my extra? God's not responding that way. God's responding with mission and vision and creativity and some sort of idea of what he should do with his extra. It changes the whole story. It changes everything. I do believe very, very seriously that for all of us in this room, it would change everything if we asked, God, what do you want me to do with my extra? Because maybe he gave you the extra for a good reason. Maybe to bless someone who is in need. Maybe so that you can teach others how to manage things well. Like, there's reasons that God has given you the great harvest that he's given you. And some of you are thinking, I don't have a great harvest. What are you talking about? No. Everybody has some kind of harvest. And maybe it's not so much that you need to build bigger barns for it, but everybody's got a harvest. Everybody's got some excess. Everybody's got some extra. And everybody can say, God, what do you want me to do with my extra? It doesn't just have to be money. Maybe it's time. Maybe it's a gift of some kind that you've been given, a talent. Maybe it's wisdom that you have in how to manage money. Maybe you're great at budgeting and you can help others budget. Every single one of us has some kind of excess that we can be blessing others with if we start out by saying, God, what do you want me to do with my extra? If guilt requires us to practice confession and anger requires us to practice forgiveness, greed requires us to practice generosity. And I have learned the hard way over the years that you cannot wait until you're in shape to start exercising. You can't wait till you feel like you've got it all together to start being generous. Generosity is a muscle that you start exercising when it's a small thing, a weak thing, and it gets stronger as you go. Generosity is a tool that God uses to change our hearts. And when we give and when we are generous, our attitude and our feelings change as well. So how do I start, Nick? Let's say I buy into all of this. How do I start? Okay, start with a percentage. That's the easiest thing to do. Just say, look, here's the amount of money that I make, and I'm going to give this percentage to something that honors God. Rather than fund my kingdom, I'm going to take this percentage and I'm going to fund God's kingdom. And it's going to be the very first thing that I fund. Before I write a check to anything of my kingdom, before I swipe a card to anything of my kingdom, I'm going to take that percentage and I'm going to write that check to something that funds God's kingdom. So let's just take 10%. That's very biblical, right? That's very churchy, 10%. If I say I'm going to give 10%, then the first thing I do is I'm going to write a check to cover my compassion children. I've got a bunch of those, right? So I'm going to write a check and send it off to Compassion International. I'm going to care for them. And then the next check is going to be a check to a nonprofit or a couple nonprofit that help to advance God's kingdom in this world. And then the next check is going to be to my church. And then the next check, you see what I'm saying? Until we give the 10%, the first 10%, right off the top, that is God's. And you might go, Dick, 10% is so much. I do not have 10% to give right now. I got you. Start with 2. Start with 2%. And I bet you won't even miss it. I bet you won't even know it's gone. I bet you that you give the 2% right away in the beginning. I bet you every other need that you have is still met. I bet you don't miss the 2% at all. And when you see that God honors the 2% you give, when you see that he takes care of all your other needs when you give the 2%, then try giving 4. See what happens. And when you see how that goes, maybe it's 6. Keep taking the little step from this side to this side and just test the waters. Just see. I'm not saying you should go on faith and go from giving 0% to 10%. I'm saying give 2% a shot and see what God does in the midst of you giving 2%. See how you can say sometimes like, I don't know how it's possible, but all my bills are paid. I don't get it because I have this much money. I did this right away in the beginning and still I don't. I've heard so many cool stories about how people have been blessed with random gifts, random kindness, random ways. And their needs are all met, and they are still giving to further God's kingdom. But here's the thing. Planned giving is good, but don't just be a planned giver. Deep down, that works for me. It's the spontaneity that doesn't work for me. I'm not Mr. Spontaneous. I don't know what you guys think of me. My wife will tell you, not Mr. Spontaneous, all right? That I have to plan my spontaneity, all right? That's the honest truth. Be a spontaneous giver. When you go drive in town and you see somebody asking for money at a stoplight, be willing to give to that. Because here's what I have done for most of my life. I've thought of every reason not to get my wallet out. I've thought of every single thing that $5 might be spent on. I thought of every reason why that person doesn't deserve what I have worked so hard to get. And you know what I've come to realize? That $5 that's in my wallet owns my heart in that moment. Sold my heart for $5. In the Old Testament, when farmers grew crops in their field, God gave rules to his people to say, when you harvest, don't harvest the edges. That way, people who are in need, who need a meal, they can come take some from your field, from your excess. When God developed his nation, he gave rules and laws about generosity. He told us to take care of those who are poor, who are needy, the widow, the orphan. He named groups of people who often need assistance and help in some way, shape, or form. When the church was first founded in the book of Acts, there was division between the Jews and the Gentiles. And there were Gentile women not being fed enough. And so they had to come to the disciples and say, we're not getting what we're supposed to be getting, and they had to redo things because there are people who need to be cared for in that way. And the $5 in my wallet that I worked so hard to get might mean so much more to the person asking for $5 than I can possibly ever imagine. And me being willing to hand over the $5 rather than going through my head and thinking of every reason why I shouldn't might change their day, their world, it might change their everything. And that $5 is worth so much more to them than it is to me. I do not want to sell my heart for $5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or 100 or whatever the amount is. I want to be willing to be a spontaneous giver, and when a need comes up in front of me, I mean, it's like a match made in heaven. If Jesus puts a need in front of me and he gives me the resources to meet the need, match, baby. There are times when I come across a need that I don't have the resources to meet. Okay, that's not a match. But there are times when somebody's asking for any change that I have, and in my wallet is $5, and I can part with the $5. That's a match, baby. Start looking for matches. I'm not saying you have to meet every need. I'm not saying that you should make yourself homeless to do all these other things. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying don't sell your soul. Don't sell your heart for $5. Plan to give. Make it the first thing you do with the money that you have been blessed to receive. Plan to give, and then be willing to spontaneously meet the needs that God puts in your path. Ask the question, God, what do you want me to do with my extra? God, what do you want me to do with my extra? Because it changes everything. Everything. You know, our church, I'll say this and then I'll just be done. But our church is a part of a larger denomination. And that denomination asks if all the churches in the denomination can give a tithe to the denomination. And that does a whole bunch of stuff. It pays for missionaries around the world. It pays for a whole bunch of nonprofits that the denomination has started, provides clothes and food and shelter and meals and all sorts of stuff. It also helps us have a bishop that provides oversight for our churches. I mean, there's all sorts of things that 10% can do. And our church had struggled to give the 10% because times were tight, things were hard. And we just looked at the budget and said, I don't know how we can give the 10%. Well, let's give something. We can't do it. Until somebody on our board said, I really believe we should stretch for this. I really believe that in faith, we should plan to give the 10%. And so we said, all right, let's work our way there. We can't do the full 10 in one shot. This year, let's give 5. Next year, let's give 8. Next year, let's give 10. Let's work toward it. Let's have the faith that no matter how much or how little comes in, we're going to be able to give the 10%. And our stuff, our heat, our electric, our whatever is still going to be cared for. You know, the last 2 years, we've given 10%. And the lights are on. There's heat in here. I don't know if you're too hot or you're cold today, but those things have been met. We stretched for it. You might not even know that we were stretching for it. We stretched for it. I'm not trying to come before you and tell you to do stuff that we're not willing to do ourselves. I don't give a full 10% to the church. The 10% that I give is spread out across a whole bunch of different places because that's where my heart's at. I'm not telling you to give 10% to the church. I'm not here begging you for money or asking you for money. I'm begging you to have a heart that honors God by asking the question, God, what do you want me to do with my extra? Let's be the sort of people in this community and then in this community that are known for generosity. That when we hear of a need, we're like, okay, God, you have clearly told me. The church has said there is a need. This house just burned down. This person just lost their job. This thing is going on. Their spouse just passed away. Let's come around these different needs and let's meet those things. Because that's what we're called to do. Let's be the kind of community that is known for our generosity. That we give our time, we give our energy, we give our gifts, and we give our money so that it doesn't have a hold on our hearts. Don't sell your heart for $5, friends. That's all I'm saying. Generosity doesn't just protect us from greed. It's a habit that'll change our life. Amen? Amen. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for our time together today, and I do just pray over our hearts and our wallets and our gifts and our spirits. I pray that you would make us a people who are willing and able to give with a generous heart, not begrudgingly. You know, Paul says that God loves a cheerful giver. Maybe I don't always feel cheerful when I give, but I want to, God. And I realize it's a hard issue for me. So I'm not going to pretend that it's going to be painless for my heart to be reshaped. But I am going to ask God that you consistently reshape my heart to look more like yours, that my generosity may look more like yours, that my generosity would honor and glorify you, that I would be willing to take the courage to ask the hard question, God, what do you want me to do with my extra? How can I build your kingdom, not my kingdom? Make us generous, God. Bless us that we can be generous. Care for our needs. You know what they are. I believe deep down that fear should not have a hold on us in this way. So relieve us from the fear that you will not take care of us and show us over and over and over, as many times as it takes to get it through our thick skulls, that you will take care of us. and let us give. God, we love you and give you all of these things. In your name, amen.
Hi, this is Pastor Nick. Thanks for listening. I hope something that you heard today was very helpful. If you want to connect with us further, feel free to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, or our website, conoychurch.org. Sure, I'm glad we're in this together.